Friday, June 12th here at Cape, and today Heather and I have a couple great interviews to share with you. Our first one is with Gloucester Police Chief Ed Conley.
Yes, Ed Conley was at the protest. We're calling it a protest, but there really were more like vigils at the Rotary last week, and he gave us his feelings, his sentiments about being there. It was kind of emotional for him, but these protests are still going on. And what's really interesting is that across the nation, they're just as important this week. But also in our little Essex, Massachusetts, there was a protest on Wednesday night led by a 7-year-old boy. So again, these protests are really important and really relevant, and Chief Ed Conley has a lot to say.
Yeah, so here he is talking about the youth peace movement, as well as his involvement with the Massachusetts Chiefs of Police Association, and a whole lot more. It's a great chat. Hope you enjoy.
We are now joined by Gloucester Police Chief Ed Conley to talk about all the action that happened this week. And we really would love to get his opinion and afterthoughts on the peaceful protest that happened. How are you doing, Chief Conley?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on this Friday. I apologize for my casual attire. It's sort of spring cleaning day here at GPD, so I'm moving around dusty old boxes and stuff.
You're given on a Friday of a very busy week.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So, Chief Conley, I'm sorry. I want to ask you first, you were in attendance at the protests this week that happened in Gloucester that were initiated by the Gloucester High School students. Did you know that you would be kneeling in solidarity with those students? It's a beautiful.
No idea at all. In fact, we can get into this later on, but I had spent the night before in Boston, in another capacity as a law enforcement, as a chief, but in another different capacity. And, so when I got here, I had a lot going on and trying to get up to speed. And then I definitely wanted to make it out there to that rally. When I got there, I was just overwhelmed by the number of people that showed up. Everybody was wearing masks. Everybody was respectful. And I knew already that it was Gloucester High School students who had organized it. I didn't know who they were specifically. I hadn't met them. We had been in touch with them through our SROs and just kind of help coordinate whatever they needed, make sure everybody's going to be safe and give them our support. But when I got there, they approached me early on and they were just so excited about what they had accomplished. And I think, first of all, I have daughters, and I have a daughter who is graduating high school today, as a matter of fact, not really physically doing anything, but today would have been her graduation day. So to see that feeling, especially in young women, that they could put an effort toward something like this, and then to see the tangible affirmation of it all coming together in their eyes. And then so I was just feeling good about that. And they asked me, they said, Chief, would you take a knee with us in support? And I had no problem. I didn't hesitate to do it.
So Chief, I just want to know, what was there did you help or work in concert with this youth peace movement to help coordinate the event, or just give them sort of some parameters to work in just to be safe? What were those parameters?
So as soon as we found out it was happening, and I understood that the date and who was organizing it, and certainly, the mayor is very, very in touch with this community. So she knows everything before anybody else knows. And she helped us figure out who was involved and who was organizing it. And once we realized it was high school students, I had Officer Scola and Officer Sutera reach out to them and say to them, tell us what you need. We want you to be safe. We want your event to be successful and safe for everybody. Tell us what you need. And that communication started, and we were able to bring some officers together. And where they were was really obviously an easier spot. There was some concern, as I'm sure you're well aware, and a lot of other communities are dealing with this, where they have, local residents and in a lot of cases, high school students who are organizing some type of I don't even know if it's a protest. I really didn't feel like what happened out at the Circle was necessarily a protest as much as a support, right? We support this effort to change things in this country, right? I felt like that was the vibe. So unfortunately, what ends up happening is social media takes a hold of it, and the rumor mill starts really cranking up, and then we start getting reports that there might be, agitators coming, people who aren't even associated with any of this. They just find opportunity to go into places that might be in a little bit of a chaotic situation and take advantage of that. And so we have to plan a little bit for those contingencies, which we did. And fortunately, none of that came to be.
In contrast to Gloucester, Chief, you just mentioned that you had been in Boston. Do you want to tell us about what you were doing there this week?
Sure. One of the other duties that I have as a chief in the state is that I am one of 3 control chiefs for what we call NEMLEC, which is a regional team. So police departments up in the Northeast region here. When I say Northeast, I mean from sort of like from Carlisle, Newton, Natick, that area, all the way north. We commit to giving resources at a time like this when something happens. It doesn't have to be a protest. It could be a weather event. It could be any number of things. And within that organization, we also have a special tactics team, and we have what's called an RRT. And these are people who are specially trained to handle crowd controls. We deploy them, say, around the Super Bowl or when World Series, those types of events, just to have that added contingency. So in that capacity, we were called out late on Sunday to respond to Boston, given the events that were unfolding that I'm sure everybody saw on TV.
And what was the climate there? And this is in such stark contrast to what you just described in Gloucester. But could you tell us about Boston?
I mean, you couldn't have said it better. In my mind, the juxtaposition of me at the circle with that crowd and talking to people and meeting families and understanding what was going on, and having just, a little while earlier been in a totally different uniform, in a tactical uniform, and in Boston, and witnessing firsthand some of the looting and making an arrest and all this sort of thing. It was different. And I think this, just my opinion, it's some conversation I've had with other people who may not have been there or even been here. The two things end up getting kind of mashed together, right? And that wasn't my experience. I didn't feel like what I saw in terms of the rioting, the looting, had a whole lot to do with the marching and, the exercise of free speech that happened earlier. Just maybe it did in other places, but from where I was at, and we were in and around Boylston, between Boylston and Copley, and I felt like the people that were doing those types of things where I was at were not really, involved in the bigger movement.
Mm-hmm. You were really seeing the looting happening. You were in that area where that was the worst, right?
It wasn't necessarily, I don't know if it was the worst, but there were, when we got there and we deployed, there were a number of broken windows in and around Ring Street in Boston. In fact, I met a gentleman who was a store manager at Star Market that was standing watch outside where the windows had been broken and somebody had already gone in. So we assisted. We have canine assets. We had the dogs go in and to make sure no one was in there and that it was safe for him to have a board up service come. And while we were there, we had, reports of people in Copley. We sent a team into Copley to kind of clear them all out. And then we had right across the street, we had a group kind of come out of I want to say it was a Saks Fifth Avenue with a couple of jackets that we actually arrested one during that time period. So it was a little chaotic that night. And then we went there subsequent nights and it really the tempo kind of went down each subsequent night. And we never, fortunately, and I know things aren't necessarily over, but I don't think we ever reached that point of that first night again.
Chief, did you watch the George Floyd video?
I did. I watched the same video that everybody else has seen.
And do you have any response to that in terms of being a police officer?
I do. And, it is, I will say this, there have been events where the police use of force has come under scrutiny for a number of different reasons. And a lot of times there's sort of almost two sides kind of start to emerge. Well, police didn't have to do that. They could have done this, they could have done that. And then someone, either a police officer, someone who has an understanding of use of force and policy, and they kind of could have you have to understand the police officer's perspective. I haven't heard that once in this whole time. I haven't heard a single person say to me, well, you got to understand that officer, not once. I don't think there's a person out there that thinks that man who did that had any justification to do that. Certainly was never trained to do that. And none of us are trained to do that. So yeah, I mean, I felt like it was disgusting. The mayor said it yesterday in a different interview that she felt like she witnessed a murder. And I can see how Americans watching that video could see it that way.
Chief, I'm wondering I think a lot of people are asking, what is the first step towards reconciliation or real change? And I don't even mean from a police department's point of view. Just like the racial disparity, it's just a lifelong issue. It just perpetuates. And I think it just seems like there are two sides that don't know what the actual first step is, because most of us don't live with each other. You know,
Right.
it's whether it's by choice, and for most it's not, but it's a segregated society. And I think people just sort of are reaching for, well, what can you do? Because there's only so much you can do on social media or holding up a cardboard sign. Like, where does actual change begin?
Kory, I'm going to interrupt because I want to ask that question sort of from a different angle. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah.
So I was thinking that the way you've described these two settings, there's Gloucester and there's Boston, we're doing something right in Gloucester. Of course, it's a much smaller municipality. So what are we doing right, and what can we do better?
Well, first I would say, inherent in that question is the assumption that Boston's doing something wrong, and they're not. I mean, Boston, and particularly Boston Police, I don't remember what night it was now. I think it might have been Tuesday night. I was in the operations center at Boston Police headquarters with the mayor, with the Commissioner Gross, and those two are absolutely focused on, what can we do better in policing? Even if Boston Police had really nothing to do with what happened out there, it still says, are we doing everything we can to connect the community? Are we building trust in our community? Gloucester is, Boston has a lot of different ethnic areas, all with slightly different cultures, and and sometimes perhaps that makes things a little bit more challenging to bring people together and build consensus around issues. Certainly, in here in Gloucester, it's not exactly like that. It's smaller. A lot of families been here a very long time. They know each other. I was told when I got here, everybody's related. That is true. So I think it's two totally different types of populations. And for me, as a kid who grew up in Chelsea, I mean, I grew up in a very diverse, city, 2.1 square miles, 45,000 people from every part of the planet you can imagine living there. And even on my own street, I used to always say I grew up on Sesame Street. It was like that. So it's difficult for me to understand what it must be like to live and grow up in a place where everybody's just like you, and how difficult it can be to integrate with other people. I can tell you from a law enforcement perspective, one thing we spent a lot of time over the last actually more than that, it was 2016, I think, when I rolled out this training, is, we spent a lot of time talking about this and training all the officers statewide here in Massachusetts on a thing called fair and impartial policing and procedural justice. And we talk a lot about implicit bias, which is, not the sort of explicit bias we're all familiar with of someone who's clearly bigoted, would say it, post it, all these things. But really what the conversation we're having as police officers is around implicit bias and what that means for us. Oh, and by the way, all human beings have some level of implicit bias. It's hardwired, deeply hardwired into our brains. So these are areas that I'm happy to talk more about that and things we do here in the police department regarding change and making things better.
Give us one example
of something we do here.
Yeah, working on that implicit bias.
So what's interesting is there are movements online, national movements online that are, I'm not sure, President Obama has one, I think it's at change.org, that has 4 things that you're supposed to send to the mayor, and it's a pledge and get the police chief to sign off on. And of those 4 things, we've already done them. Have we reviewed our use of force? We did. The Massachusetts, after Ferguson, even though there were, we could talk, I don't want to talk about, I wasn't there, but that's one of those cases where there's kind of 2 sides. And you have to understand the use of force, the officer's perspective, but you also have to understand the years of history between that police department and that community all colliding together. But that aside, it didn't matter to us. We were saying, well, are we using force? Just because we can use force doesn't mean we have to use force, was the question, right? We asked ourselves. And we rolled out all kinds of new training. So when it comes to, say, procedural justice, I'm actually very proud that Captain Batchelor from the Chelsea Police Department and I were tapped on the shoulder to put a statewide training together. And then we went around the state and trained trainers to go and train for in-service across all the police departments. And what that stands for is you can have a negative experience with the police. So you could be traveling, speeding today down 128 and get pulled over, and the police officer treats you in one way, and you are just seething, and they take off and they leave, and the next thing you're calling, you're complaining, you're just upset, and you're mad, and you're putting that on the police officer because you got a ticket, even though you were speeding. But just accept the fact that you were speeding. And then there's other ways that there's other things that we can do in the way that we treat you, in the way we talk, the way we explain things, that you can get that ticket. And maybe at the first you're a little chagrined, so you're feeling a little like you want to blame somebody else and the cop and everything. We've all experienced that, but ultimately you'll come to a realization that you got to take, I was speeding at the end of the day, and the officer was respectful, and I felt, most importantly, is that I felt that the process was fair and impartial. And so we do a lot of training around, and it's a very big class, and there's a lot of moving parts. Implicit bias is really, it's an interesting thing because it's evolutionary biology and how this came and why we have it and how it served us well when we were living in caves and in savannas, and we had to make very, very, very quick decisions about friend or foe or danger or safe. And the people who are really good at that, of course, live long enough to procreate and then, have their genes move on. So now we have that in our sort of reptilian brain that we have very, all of us have felt it when you feel that, fear of something, or your feet start to sweat, or you start to get the palpitations in your heart and you don't know why. Well, that's all coming from that part of your brain that it's, and it's still there. And now what's interesting about that is that, marketers, people who are trying to sell you things, they're very, very, in tune to implicit bias, because they use it to get you to, buy products and all these other things. And that's a whole different class. We'll do that another time. But we have to be aware of as police officers, because we are at times, fortunately it's very, very rare, but that we have to make very critical decisions very, very quickly about life and death. And so we have to understand and train our brains to be able to evaluate that information coming in, and almost put like a circuit breaker in there a little bit to say, that when possible, to evaluate. And it's like, you don't want that circuit breaker to kick off in the moment if you have a half a second to make a decision between your life or somebody else's life and the use of deadly force. But what we want to do is reset that circuit breaker in training by doing a lot of scenario-based training, a lot of when do we use force, when do we de-escalate, and by doing that, we can retrain that circuit breaker for us.
Mm. I think we all need, or maybe there are a lot of people in this country who need their circuit breakers retrained. Maybe that's where
I don't want to sound like a nerd. I am a little bit, but there's a great book out there by Daniel Kahneman that's called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And it really, my hat's off to anybody that wants to read it, but it's also available on audiobook. So, but it's really, it takes a real deep dive into this part of our brain. It's really interesting. And this is some areas where we've been spending time in law enforcement, at least here in Massachusetts.
Mm. Well, go ahead, Kory.
Yeah, Chief, I just wanted to circle back to the peaceful shows of support that happened earlier this week. Is we noticed when they were getting organized and publicized that we were also seeing, especially on social media, random threats from different aspects. And did the force follow up on any of that? And was it just unfounded stuff? Because this is just rampant on social. Like, that's just what we're living in right now.
Right, and it's actually not just here in Gloucester; it's everywhere. In fact, today I was talking about the NEMLEC teams that I'm a part of. We're deployed in a number of different communities today, spread apart, not because they have any direct information that the organizers of the event are planning some type of violence, but because of social media and other avenues of communication, saying that there are going to be other elements that may probably not even involved in any of this, that are coming to take advantage of the opportunity of police being sidetracked. No, I won't say sidetracked, but having to put their resources on protecting, making a safe place for people who want to express their opinions. And luckily here in Gloucester, that hasn't panned out. I haven't really heard of it panning out on a large scale in any of these other communities so far. Doesn't mean that it couldn't happen. But a lot of the sort of national organizations that are involved in this, Black Lives Matters, of course, one that's received a lot of attention, they typically call and just tell you, hey, we're coming, this is kind of what we want to do, and we expect this number of people, and we plan, we have communication, and we try to figure out what they need. Now, what happened at the Fisherman statue is that when we had that rally, the rally decided to march up to City Hall, right? And you could feel like, well, did you have a plan for that? Well, we didn't have a plan for them to go to City Hall, but we did have a plan in case they went on the move somewhere. and we knew places they could go and it could be safe. And if they went to a certain place, we had to sort of try to use our leverage the relationships we had with the organizers to say, this isn't safe down here for anybody. Can we go this way? You know, and they were completely respectful. And that's
cool.
That's interesting.
And just to change gears just a little bit is police morale, and we're still in the midst of this pandemic, and now we're seeing reopenings happening. Just the health of the department and reaction to this last wave of reopening.
Yeah, I mean, I think Karen Carroll and her staff, I don't know what the equivalent Board of Health Medal of Honor is, but whatever it is, we have to come up with one. I don't know. We can really think about that. I'm already starting to get creative with ideas around it. But probably be like a wine glass on a chain would be the one that would be most needed over there. But I mean, I can't. I mean, it's incredible. They have handled this so professionally and stayed with the science, stayed on meshes the entire time. I mean, I have a whole newfound, I don't say newfound, but a whole amount of respect for her and her department. And they're doing a great job. And as we don't want, I feel like people want to make everything binary, right? Yes, wrong, on, off. Our brains want to do that. And we have to be more nuanced about it and see how it goes and be prepared to pivot. But as far as I can tell, everybody's doing a great job. It's difficult, but there are people who want us to have sort of zero tolerance and enforcement, and without boring your audience, there are a lot of problems with that in terms of social distancing and mask wearing when it comes to law enforcement kind of getting involved in that. So we're trying to find creative ways to encourage people like we have from the beginning, but we haven't had any instances yet where we've had an issue from this department issue any citations or fines to anybody.
And were you concerned? Well, you said that there was pretty good social distancing at the protests and everyone was wearing masks. So you felt pretty comfortable with those events?
I wouldn't say there was pretty good social distancing, but I would say everybody was wearing masks, which to me creates a different risk profile for the social distancing. If someone's wearing a mask or a covering, the social distancing is really meant to be in place when you don't have that, right? Now, certainly, optimally, you want both, but if you have a mask on or a face covering and you're closer to somebody else, there's still a different risk profile than without a mask. So I was comfortable with that, yes.
Good. Well, we thank you so much for taking the time. Anything else you would like the community to hear from you?
I really just like to say that, there's always room for improvement in the work we do. And I'm very proud of our profession here, particularly in Massachusetts, and the Mass Chiefs Association is very active in considering our training for the year. We spend a lot of time on training. Our officers are trained at least 40 hours at a minimum every single year. And some of the things you're going to start to hear about, remember, fair and impartial policing, that procedural justice, all these things that came out of the President's 21st century report on policing, we've been doing here for a long time. And I'm proud of that. And I feel like that's why, we don't see instances like that happen here. It's not by accident. It's because I feel strongly it's our recruitment and our training.
Well, that's great to hear too. So thanks for that. And thanks for talking with us.
Great. Yeah. Have a happy weekend.
Good cleaning. Good luck today.
Get back. Yeah, I can get back. Yeah. This was a great break from it.
Okay.
Thanks, Chief.
Provide that. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Kory, do you have any idea that this Massachusetts Chiefs of Police Association existed and that our chief of police was working in Boston all week?
No, I never heard of that before, but I guess it makes sense, right? I guess in times of crisis or emergency, to tap on the shoulders of all the head honchos from all these forces to congregate. I can't believe he's been in Boston or regularly doing this and been away from the Gloucester Department. So pretty impressive.
And actually, it came up, I don't think he would have mentioned this to us, except when I was setting up the interview. He said, well, I just can't talk right now because I'm headed back into Boston again. So when we did meet with him, I said, so why are you going to Boston? Well, what's that about? And that's when he finally explained about having this extra duty with the Mass Chiefs of Police Association. So very cool.
Yeah, and what a great guy to interview too. So I can't wait to talk with him again. We also had a fun conversation this week with Eric Hutchins. He is with NOAA and has been doing great work studying eels that are actually traveling from one spot, Millbrook Meadow in Rockport.
Yeah, they have a really, really long voyage, and they make that voyage when they're about this big. And Eric and his team are in Millbrook Meadow counting them. They count Not every single one that arrives, but many of them. And I actually had the opportunity to go down and meet Eric. You can too, Kory. He's there every 9 o'clock on Saturday mornings. And you can see him checking the eel trap and counting the eels.
You will not believe how much these little guys are worth.
Cape Ann plays a vital role in an important international story. We're talking to Eric Hutchins. Eric is the habitat restoration biologist for the NOAA Restoration Center. Hi, Eric.
How are you? Good morning.
Good. Can you tell us about the life cycle of the American eel and why it's important on Cape Ann?
Yeah, why is it important on Cape Ann? Well, in particular, it's important on Cape Ann. All fish are, because the fishing industry and recreational fishing are so important for so many jobs, so many people, for their recreation. So even in general, fish are important. If you live on Cape Ann, you gotta relate to fish. And a lot of people don't necessarily think about eels because they often don't see them or think about them. But eels are everywhere around Cape Ann. They're in all of our waterways. I grew up in East Gloucester. I grew up in Rockport and Gloucester. And I grew up catching little eels, big eels at Good Harbor Beach as a child, putting them in buckets like everybody else has as a child. They're there, but you often don't see them. Eels are not on the menu too often. Matter of fact, they're almost never on our menu around here. Though if you travel to anywhere in Europe, almost any decent restaurant in Europe is serving American or European eel.
Hold on, sushi. They're on sushi.
They are on sushi. And actually some of the sushi eels, which I will get to in a moment, that get imported to the United States from Japan or somewhere else in Asia may have actually originated right here in New England, which I will get to that, which is a little bit of the economic side of American eels. But anyway, American eels, a quick synopsis of their life cycle, and the work that we do, in particular that I'm doing in Rockport with local volunteers. At the Rockport Millbrook Meadow, a park where the little dam is, just up the stream from Front Beach, there's a dam, and we have an eel trap on the top side of that dam, and we've been monitoring it now for 5 years, catching all of the eels that swim up the stream, trying to make their way into Rockport waters. And we catch them every year with volunteers. We have a group of 7 or 8 volunteers that once a day we check the eel trap and collect the data. Those baby eels returning from the ocean are usually 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 inches long. That's it. And for the most part, these are the eels that were born last fall. And one of the things I want to bring up is many of the points I'm bringing up are the very talking points that I talk with people in the public. Because our eel trap is in the middle of a municipal park, every day we check that eel trap, unless it's pouring rain, the public comes over to us and says, "What are you doing?" And they ask their standard set of questions, or I give my standard set of questions to them to invigorate some dialogue, such as, "Where did those eels come from?" And then I say to them, how far away do you think these 2-inch eels swam to get to Rockport? And it's often a family, sometimes a mother, a father, and 3 kids. "Oh, 1 mile more, 2 miles more." And then they just start looking at me really strange. And then one of the kids will say, 50 miles more. And then they're like, "You're lying." "No, more." And 1,000 miles more. And then they can't believe it. A 2-inch eel swam back to Rockport in the bucket that we just caught. These American eels are born in the range of 2,000 to 2,300 miles away from Rockport. They are born in the Sargasso Sea east of Bermuda. It's in that range, around 2,000 miles. We do not know exactly where they are born. Hundreds of years of research, and no one has ever documented an adult eel laying eggs in the Sargasso Sea. We only know where they lay their eggs because of the really super young ones that we've caught, but we've never actually found breeding eels in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, though we know based on the babies that have the very young larvae that have been captured, they follow the Gulf Stream. That's what gives them a free ride up and down up the East Coast. And
so hold on right there. So you've seen the babies in the Sargasso Sea, but not.
Yes, they've been caught out there in nets.
Okay, but never adults.
Adults have never been caught in breeding motion. Never.
That's amazing.
And only a couple of years ago was one of the first radio tagged eels released, I believe it was Newfoundland, that actually we were able to follow it almost all the way back to the Sargasso Sea on its return run to lay eggs, but then the tag fell off. So there's still a lot of mystery that we do not know about American eels. So anyway, those 2 to 3 inch eels returned around 2,000 miles from the Sargasso Sea, taking a free ride on the Gulf Stream. And then we don't know what their cue is, but they head off the Gulf Stream and head inland towards the east coast of the United States, all the way up and down the east coast of the United States and the Gulf of Mexico, and all the way up to Canada and even up into Greenland, where they start to mix with European eels. So the baby eels that return to Rockport are not eels that their parents came from here. There's nothing that tells us that we believe that. They're just random.
Yeah, they just find a little river and they start heading up.
And they just go for it.
Yeah.
So those eels come in, and I looked at some of my data for the past 5 years in Rockport. Since 2016, the earliest we've caught an eel in Rockport. We set the trap every year, April 1st, and we run it through Columbus Day. It's one of the longest operating traps in Massachusetts. Most of them end by early July. This one we start about the same time as a few other traps in Massachusetts, but carry it all the way to the fall. Our earliest is, I think, April 14th back in 2017. We got our first eel with a water temperature of 14 degrees Celsius. Other years, the latest that we've caught a returning eel in Rockport was June 8th. So thus far, with 5 years worth of data, that's kind of our range. Really late is early June, really early is early April. That's kind of the range that we catch our first eel. And our last eels, they're still coming in. September 1, October 5th, October 5th, October 12th. Those are the variety of years that's the last. And it's really good that they end around October, because it starts to rain a lot, it starts to get cold, and people get tired of checking the trap after almost 6 months, including myself. So it's kind of fun that way. Installing the trap in April, there's still sometimes, or late March, there's still sometimes ice on the pond, and hands are getting pretty cold setting that trap up, which sometimes takes a couple of hours. So anyway, first eels arrive early April. They're 2 to 3, 3 to 4 inches. And they come up into Mill Pond, and this is happening all up and down the East Coast, but I'm using the Rockport Mill Pond as our example for Cape Ann. And they'll live, and then one of the other questions I ask people is, how long do you think they live here? They're not like salmon, they're not like river herring that go up, lay their eggs, and leave. They're coming here to live. They're called catadromous. So they live most of their lives in fresh water or nearshore estuaries. The females go further upstream, typically get larger, live in the larger lakes. They can go upstream hundreds of miles, live their life out upwards and over 20 years in a freshwater system. And then they get a cue, which we don't know exactly what it is, towards the end of the summer, early fall. They stop eating, they put on lots of fat, and then they get the cue to out-migrate. That's when you sometimes get up to a 3-foot long, 3-inch diameter female eel that's heading back to the Sargasso Sea, and they out-migrate during large rain events in, October, November-ish, maybe late September, in the fall. So water levels are up. That way they can make it over impediments. Sometimes people see them going across grass. If there's a dam in the way, they can often make it over them. And they often out-migrate in mass. A couple of days, a couple of rain events. So there's places in the world where it's like an event. You go see the eels heading out to sea. We don't have enough in our little Millbrook to actually say, I'm going to go look at them. But 20 plus years in the system, then they'll migrate that 2,000 miles back to the Sargasso Sea, lay their eggs, and die.
So they only lay eggs once in their lifetime.
Once in their lifetime.
They'll go 20 years without reproducing.
Correct.
That's kind of unusual for a species, right?
Yes, very, very unusual. Once, that's it. You got one shot.
Right. And you go 20 years without having babies and just living a pretty good life and no stress.
Yep.
No
and
babies.
one of the unfortunate things is with a biology like that, impacts from humans can take a long time to show up in their population. Something could be installed and there's multiple generations still going out that were born years ago, but all of a sudden, 20 years later, you don't know that maybe those babies weren't living. And that's something to always worry about. Eel populations are significantly down all around the world. Worldwide. There are different species of eels. I can't remember how many, 16 or 26. I'm not an worldwide eel expert, but they're down everywhere for a variety of reasons. Habitat oriented and harvest, a little bit of everything. And parasites. So there's been a number of things happening to eels that have dropped their populations significantly.
I want to back up to the trap. What are you doing with these eels, these baby eels, once you trap them?
Oh, we have a trap that catches, in theory, every eel that makes it over the Millbrook Dam we catch. A couple might make it over, but I think we probably catch most of them that make it over that dam. We actually open up we have you can see it if you go down to the Mill Pond Dam, public location, you can see the trap. We open it up, take the temperature, always put the eels in a white bucket so that if there's any public while you're doing your work, someone can come along and look at the eels. For many people, it's the first time they've ever seen one. We count them. We just do a visual estimate of their length. We're not putting them on a measuring board. Some of the sites that biologists are working on them are taking more detailed measurements. We've found that to do this for 7 months, the visual estimate is very helpful. We do it by 1-inch increments, 2 to 3 inches, 3 to 4. Then we simply release them right there into Mill Pond.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay, great. So then they can continue their journey from the Mill Pond up into whatever river they're going to. Okay.
Yeah, and the Millbrook, gotta remember, Millbrook is only 1 square mile. It's a tiny brook. It runs into the middle of Dogtown into Briar Swamp, where we know they make it to Mill Pond. We're almost sure, though I haven't caught one yet, that they make it to Loop Pond, which is about a half mile upstream. And one of these days, I want to put a trap in Briar Swamp to see if there's any chance they're living in the Sphagnum Bog upstream. They might be. We don't know. They're that ubiquitous. They can live in just moist areas, and live on insects and other things. We just don't know.
And you mentioned earlier that people just don't see them. Are they sort of really secretive in their habitat?
Yeah, they're dark. Yeah. Their coloration is amazingly good at hiding. So they're in muddy. So when they first enter from the ocean, they're called glass eels. If you've never seen a glass eel, it's amazing. Perfectly translucent, other than an eye spot and some of the internal pieces of bone. Even the bone is translucent. That's to allow them to make it through the water column from the Sargasso Sea. The moment they enter fresh water, they start to take on pigment. So then they hide in a freshwater system with browns and grays and black. A typical pond and stream where they like to live is black mud and detritus. So it's very hard to see them. They also like to live in crevices. So they're in the mud in the base, they're in walls, they're in a lot of times if I'm snorkeling in an area, they're living under a rock and all you see is the head sticking out. So they hide in ubiquitous places. But I'll tell you one place which is kind of unique that you see them very, very clearly once in a while. Halibut Point State Park, the quarry. Eels have found their way there. That's a man-made quarry. There's no definitive stream running out of it, but there are seeps that are running down to the ocean, and they've even discovered those, and some have made it. I don't think anyone transplanted in there. They found their way into Halibut Point State Park. Halibut Point has eels that actually make it in it as babies, and I've seen tremendous sizes, only a couple of them, but sometimes because of the clear water in a quarry, you can see them perfectly. Unlike in a pond, you look down and you can actually watch them swim along the ledges.
That's
really, really neat.
So Eric, here is my question. I'm curious about tagging these eels. What does that entail?
Adults, not the babies, but the adults, they can actually put what's called a Vemco tag. It's a tag that actually is picked up by satellites. A big eel can actually be tagged with it's called the Vemco tag, or there's some other types. So they actually can pick up the data from a satellite, so we know its depth, that it's swimming, and we can pick it up, its pace underwater. believe it or not. The tag gets released and releases the data. So it's used a lot on tuna fish and swordfish and turtles and large pelagic species, but they're getting smaller and people are experimenting with them on smaller fish now.
Very cool.
I think it's only been done a couple of times with eels.
One last question. How are we protecting the eels?
We're protecting them. Only 2 states in the East Coast of the United States allow a harvest. South Carolina and Maine, and not that many are harvested in South Carolina. These are the babies. Maine has a harvest. I can't remember what the number of pounds is, but the price of eels is a big driver. It's the second number one. It's the second economic fishery in the state of Maine next to lobsters. And this is my other question to people. How much for a pound of eels? I said, okay, let's say a pound of good shrimp is $15 a pound. I'll ask the public, how much for a pound of eels? And they'll start guessing, $20, $30, more. A pound of baby eels caught in the springtime will fetch, in the past few years, as much as $2,500 a pound. Fishermen can catch sometimes as much as 10 pounds in one night. It is a tremendously lucrative fishery. And it's a quota, so it's quota driven. When the quota is done, the fishery shuts down. And then adult eels, and those fish are mostly, if not all, flown in airplanes over to Japan and some other countries in Asia, where they grow them out for about 1.5 years to about 1.5 to 2 feet long, and they're mostly used for the sushi market and Japanese market. So a lot of them actually come back to the United States to make it into our restaurants.
Oh. Well, this is such a fascinating story, and it's so great to hear that that you guys are doing work to keep track of them, at least in Millbrook Meadow. And what time are you usually there, Eric? Because I want to go check.
We try, in years past, we try to do Saturdays at 9 a.m.
Okay.
The other days, we let people do it whenever they want, which makes it simpler.
Right.
Like your own. But I try to do most Saturdays. I try to go at 9 a.m. This year, like everything, it's been a little mixed up. But 9 a.m. on Saturdays, and if anyone ever wants an appointment to actually see the eels, like yourselves or people I'm more than happy to line up a time when people can come down and see the eels. And it can be done through social distancing as well. I'll put the bucket out and they can look at them.
Right.
We caught our first eel this year on April 20th. We've only caught 7 so far this year. Last year, we caught a total of 308 throughout the season. And in 2017, we caught 1,924. So we never know how many are going to come in. In 2016, we caught a total of only 10. So we just don't know. We never know. So it's always a mystery. You might go down there this Saturday and I'll have 500. We've actually caught as many as 500 in one day. Never know what we're going to catch. So it's really neat to get down there and see. More than happy to show people anytime they want.
Great. Okay, we're going to have to go to our next meeting, but can we include your email in the copy so that people could reach out to you?
Absolutely.
Appointment? Okay.
Yep.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric, for talking to us. This is just a fascinating story.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Kory, 2,000 miles. When was the last time you traveled 2,000 miles?
I don't know if I've ever traveled 2,000 miles total in my life. Like, what are these eels?
And they're just this big. But, I think what is even more amazing is the fact they come and they live here on Cape Ann and all up and down the East Coast, as Eric said, for 25 years. They hang out here for 25 years and they don't leave again until they're ready to have babies after 25 years. That's a funny life cycle.
Yeah, and it's amazing how they're finding their ways into other little estuaries and ponds all around Cape Ann, well, really up around this whole area. But it was a pretty fascinating chat. I enjoyed that one.
Yeah, I did too. So that was a fun week and 2 good interviews, right?
Yeah, we want to thank Chief Ed Conley and Eric Hutchins and everyone else we spoke to this week on Cape Ann Today. We want to thank our partners at the Gloucester Daily Times and, of course, our sponsors, Salo Home Watch. I have 2 little tidbits for you for this weekend, Heather. One is that the CVS at Gloucester Crossing opens on Sunday. There's a groundbreaking ceremony there this Sunday morning, June 14th. By the way, happy Flag Day, everyone. And then on Monday, the parking meters go back up in Rockport.
Oh.
Have a great weekend.